My brother secretly changed our mother's will the night before the funeral, then asked me to pay every funeral bill. I sat in the velvet-lined silence of Montgomery and Sons Funeral Home, the scent of lilies and floor wax thick enough to taste. Across the mahogany desk, Mr. Montgomery, a man who had buried 3 generations of our family with the same somber expression, pushed a heavy cream folder toward the center of the table. The gold-embossed lettering on the front read, Sterling. My mother, Mrs. Evelyn Sterling, was resting in the parlor next door, draped in the lavender silk suit I had spent 3 hours steaming until the creases were sharp enough to cut glass. The total for the premium service, the mahogany casket, the vault, and the floral arrangements comes to $22,418, Mr. Montgomery said softly. He didn't look at me. He looked at my brother, Terrence. Terrence, whom everyone in Savannah called TJ, leaned back in his chair. He was wearing a black suit I had bought him 2 years ago for a job interview he never attended. He rubbed his eyes, the image of a grieving son, though I hadn't seen him shed a single tear since Mama took her last breath in the hospital bed I had paid to have installed in her living room. 22,000, Terrence repeated, his voice raspy with a practiced sorrow. Mama deserved the best. She was a queen. We can't cut corners on a queen. I agree, I said, my voice steady, the practiced tone of a woman who had spent 24 years as a high school principal. I opened my handbag to reach for my checkbook, the familiar weight of responsibility settling into my shoulders. I'll take care of the deposit today, and the rest. Actually, Clarissa, Terrence interrupted, finally looking at me. His eyes were clear, devoid of the red-rimmed exhaustion that had settled into mine. I was thinking. Since I'm the executor now, and the house is, well, the situation has shifted. I think it's only right that you handle the full balance. You've always been the one with the big career, the one with the stability. I paused, my hand resting on the cool leather of my wallet. The executor? Terrence, Mama's will has named me executor since Daddy died in 2008. We discussed this. I have the power of attorney. I have the 2008 will is old news, sis, Terrence said, reaching into his inner coat pocket. He pulled out a stapled document, the paper crisp and terrifyingly white against the dark wood of the desk. He slid it toward me. Mama had a change of heart. She realized that since I was the one living with her, the one taking care of her while you were busy running your school, that I should be the one to look after her legacy. I picked up the document. My eyes skipped past the legalese, searching for the date. August 14th, yesterday. The night before the funeral. The night Mama's breathing had turned into a ragged, wet rattle. The night the hospice nurse had told us she was no longer lucid. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was a shaky, jagged scrawl. It looked like my mother's hand, but it looked like her hand if it had been guided by someone else's. She signed this yesterday? I whispered, the air in the room suddenly feeling very thin. She wanted to make sure I was situated, Clarissa. Her words, Terrence said, his voice dropping into that oily, comforting tone he used when he was about to ask for a $500 loan he'd never repay. She knew you were set. You have the pension, the savings, the house in the suburbs. But me? I gave up my life to stay in that house with her. She wanted me to have the property, all of it, and the accounts. The accounts, I repeated. My mother's savings weren't millions, but they were the result of 40 years of teaching and a husband who had been a master carpenter. It was enough to sustain the house for decades. Everything, Terrence said. But the lawyer says the probate process takes time. The funds are frozen. And Mr. Montgomery needs his payment by tomorrow morning if we're going to have the service at the cathedral. He leaned forward, placing a hand over mine. His palm was sweaty. You wouldn't want Mama to be turned away from her own church because of a little thing like a bill, would you? Pay it, Clarissa. For her. I looked at him. My younger brother, the one I had bailed out of jail in his 20s, the one I had bought groceries for every month for 5 years, the one I had trusted to sit by Mama's bed while I went home to shower for 30 minutes. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel and how many people around the world connect with them. I looked down at the $22,000 bill. Then I looked at the new will that effectively stripped me of my inheritance and my standing as the head of the family. You changed the will while she was dying, Terrence, I said. It wasn't a question. I did what she asked, he snapped, the mask of the grieving son slipping for a fraction of a second. Now, are you going to pay for our mother's burial, or am I going to have to tell the family at the wake tonight that you're choosing your bank account over her dignity? I felt a phantom heat rising in my chest. The old Clarissa, the strong black woman Clarissa, the one who would have swallowed the insult, written the check, and cried in her car just to keep the peace. I looked at Mr. Montgomery. He was looking at his fingernails, clearly uncomfortable, but waiting for the only person who ever paid the bills to do what she always did. I looked at the signature on that document again. There was a tiny smudge of purple ink near the bottom, the same purple ink from the pen I had left on Mama's bedside table to keep track of her medication times. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't tell him I knew he was lying. I slowly pulled my checkbook out of my bag. I saw Terrence's shoulders relax. A small, triumphant smirk played at the corner of his mouth. He thought he knew me. He thought he had calculated the exact cost of my pride and my devotion to our mother's memory. I picked up the pen Mr. Montgomery offered. $22,418, I murmured. Exactly, Terrence said. And don't worry about the reception at the house later. I've already told the caterers to send the invoice to your email. I knew you'd want it done right. I held the pen over the check, but I didn't write a number. I looked at the bill, then back at my brother. Terrence, if you are the sole executor of the estate, and you are the sole beneficiary of the house and all the accounts, then that means the responsibility for the estate's debts lies with you. The smirk vanished. What are you talking about? I am no longer the executor, I said, my voice as calm as a Sunday morning before the bells ring. And according to this document you just handed me, I have no legal claim to Mama's assets. Therefore, I have no legal obligation to her liabilities. Clarissa, don't be petty, he hissed. This is Mama we're talking about. I am thinking of Mama, I said. I'm thinking of how she always taught us that he who holds the keys holds the weight. You have the keys now, Terrence. You have the house, you have the savings, and you have the title of executor. I placed the blank checkbook back into my purse and snapped it shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet office. Mr. Montgomery, I said, turning to the funeral director, my brother is the sole executor of the Sterling estate. He will be handling the financial arrangements from this point forward. If the estate funds are frozen, I'm sure he can find a way to secure a bridge loan or use his own considerable resources to ensure our mother has the service he says she deserves. Clarissa! Terrence stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. You can't do this! The service is in 12 hours. The guests are already arriving at the hotels. I'll be at the wake tonight, I said, standing up and smoothing the skirt of my suit. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of a burden, a massive, jagged rock I had been carrying for the entire Sterling family, finally being set down. "I'll bring a tray of sandwiches. I believe that's what sisters do when they aren't in charge, isn't it?" I walked toward the door. "You're going to let her sit in a cold room because you're mad about a house?" Terrence yelled at my back. I stopped at the door, my hand on the brass handle. I didn't turn around. "No, Terrence," I said softly. "I'm letting you be the man you've told everyone you are for 30 years. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for, the lead. Don't stumble on the first step." I walked out of the funeral home and into the humid Savannah heat. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat in silence. My heart was thudding, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I looked at my phone. A text message from my daughter, Simone, flashed on the screen. "Mom, Uncle TJ just called me screaming. He said you're abandoning the family. What's going on?" I didn't reply. Instead, I looked at the rearview mirror. I looked at the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, yes, but she also looked like she was starting to see a path through the woods. I started the engine and drove toward my mother's house, the house that was no longer mine, the house where the wake was supposed to start in 3 hours. As I pulled onto the oak-lined street, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked in the driveway. A sleek, black, luxury SUV with out-of-state plates. And then I saw the woman standing on the porch. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, wearing a dress that was far too tight for a house of mourning, holding a set of keys, my mother's keys, in her hand. She wasn't family. I pulled the car over, my eyes narrowing. I realized then that the will wasn't the only thing Terrence had been changing behind my back. The game hadn't just started. It had been playing for weeks. And I had been the only one playing by the old rules. The woman on the porch didn't belong to the neighborhood, and she certainly didn't belong to my mother's house. She was leaning against the white-painted railing, scrolling through a gold-cased iPhone with an air of profound boredom. Her hair was a waterfall of synthetic honey-blonde waves, and her nails were long, acrylic talons painted a jarring neon pink. I parked my car slowly, watching her. This was the house my father had built with his own calloused hands in 1974. Every shingle, every porch board, every brick of the chimney was a testament to a man who believed a home was a sanctuary. Now, a woman who looked like she was waiting for a club to open was holding the keys to it. I stepped out of the car. The humidity of the Georgia afternoon clung to my skin like a wet veil. I didn't rush. I walked with the measured gait of a woman who knew she owned the ground she walked on, even if the paper in my brother's pocket said otherwise. "Can I help you?" I asked as I reached the bottom step. The woman looked up. She didn't stand up straight. She just tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over my navy blue linen suit, my sensible heels, and the single strand of pearls at my throat. I saw the flash of dismissal in her eyes, the way young women look at women of a certain age and see a ghost instead of a person. "I'm waiting for TJ," she said. Her voice was thin and nasal. "He said I could head inside and get things ready." "Get things ready for what?" I asked. "The wake. He said people are coming over. He told me to start clearing out some of the clutter in the living room so there's more space for his friends." Clutter. My mother's collection of hand-painted porcelain birds. The framed photographs of 4 generations of Sterlings. The antique lace doilies my grandmother had crocheted by candlelight in a sharecropper's cabin. "And who are you?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. It was the voice I used when a senior was trying to explain why they had a flask in their locker. It was a voice that demanded an answer. The woman straightened up then, sensing the shift in the air. "I'm Sandra, TJ's associate." "Associate?" I repeated. "Well, Sandra, I am Clarissa Sterling. This is my mother's home. And while my brother may have invited you, I am telling you to step off this porch." TJ said, "I don't particularly care what Terrence said," I interrupted, stepping up onto the porch. I was taller than her, and I used every inch of it. "Until my mother is in the ground, this house is a place of mourning, not a construction site for your associates. Move." Sandra hesitated, her neon nails digging into her phone. She looked like she wanted to argue, but there is a specific kind of authority that an African-American woman who has spent 30 years in the public school system carries. It is an immovable force. She huffed, snatched up a designer knockoff bag from the porch swing, and clattered down the steps to her SUV. I watched her drive away before I pulled my own set of keys from my purse. My hand shook, just a fraction, as I slid the key into the lock. The house smelled of Mama, rosewater, mentholatum, and the faint, lingering scent of the pound cake she used to bake every Friday. But as I stepped into the foyer, the peace was gone. The living room was in disarray. Several of Mama's floral armchairs had been pushed into the corner. A cardboard box sat on the coffee table, half filled with her crystal candy dishes. My heart constricted. Terrence wasn't just claiming the house. He was already liquidating it. He was treating our mother's life like a storage unit he'd won at an auction. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the small breakfast table. The linoleum was worn in the spot where Mama used to stand and drink her tea every morning. For 20 years, I had been the one to keep this house standing. When the roof leaked in 2012, I paid the $8,000 for the architectural shingles. When the HVAC unit died during the record-breaking heat wave of 2018, I was the one who called the repairman and handed over my credit card while Terrence was between jobs. I had paid the property taxes, the insurance, and the grocery bills. I did it because I was the strong one, because I had the good job, because that's what a daughter does. And all that time, Terrence had been whispered in her ear. He had been the one there in the quiet hours, playing the part of the devoted son, while I was working 60-hour weeks to ensure the bills were paid. He had used my absence against me, turning my labor into neglect and his presence into sacrifice. The back door creaked open. "I figured I'd find you here," a voice said. I didn't look up. I knew that voice. It belonged to Aunt Bess, my mother's younger sister. She was 72, a woman who wore hats to church that were architectural marvels and who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She walked in carrying a covered dish. She set it on the counter and sat down across from me. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer platitudes. She just looked at me with eyes that had seen everything. "TJ is telling people you've lost your mind, Clarissa," she said plainly. "Is he?" "He's at the barber shop right now, telling anyone who will listen that you're refusing to pay for Evelyn's funeral out of spite. He says you're trying to humiliate him because he's the one she chose to trust. I looked at my aunt. Did you know, Aunt Bess, about the will? She sighed, a long, weary sound. She reached out and patted my hand. Her skin was like fine parchment. I knew he was working on her. I told her, Evelyn, that boy is a snake in Sunday clothes. But you know your mother. She always had a soft spot for the one she thought was the weakest. She thought you were a mountain, Clarissa. She thought nothing could move you. She thought TJ was a dandelion. One strong wind and he'd be gone. She thought she was protecting him. By stripping me of everything I've put into this house? I asked, my voice cracking for the first time. I don't care about the money, Bess. I care about the fact that she didn't think I was human enough to need a thank you. She treated me like a utility company. You don't thank the lights for staying on. You just expect them to be there. Transactional love, Bess whispered. It's the curse of the eldest daughter in our community. We build the house, and the ones who just live in it get to decide who sits at the head of the table. She leaned closer. But I saw him, Clarissa. 3 nights ago. I came by to bring some soup and I saw a man leaving the house. A white man in a cheap suit. Not a doctor, not a preacher. He had a briefcase. TJ hurried him out the back way when he saw my car. A lawyer? Or a notary, Bess said. But here's the thing. Your mother hadn't spoken a coherent word in 3 days. She was drifting, honey. She was talking to your daddy and her own mama. She wasn't signing no wills. He forged it, I said. Worse. I think he guided her hand while she was half dead. And that girl, that Sandra person, she was there too. She's not an associate. She's a paralegal for a predatory lending firm. I looked her up on the Facebook. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If Sandra worked for a lending firm, Terrence wasn't just looking for a place to live. He was looking for collateral. He had probably already borrowed money against a house he didn't even legally own yet. The front door opened and the sound of voices flooded the house. The family was arriving. In our community, a wake is not just a gathering, it is a performance. It is where the hierarchy of the family is established and reinforced. As I walked into the living room, I saw them. My cousins, the deacons from Mama's church, and the neighbors. They all stopped talking when I entered. The air was thick with the look. It's a specific kind of judgment, the way people look at a successful woman and wait for her to fail so they can feel better about their own struggles. Clarissa, sugar, Cousin Darnell said, stepping forward. He was a man who had never held a job for more than 6 months, but always had a new car. We heard there was some trouble at the funeral home. TJ said the bill isn't settled. I looked around the room. I saw the expectation in their eyes. They weren't worried about Mama. They were worried that if I didn't pay, the burden might fall on them. Or worse, that the Sterling reputation would be tarnished, and they'd have nothing to brag about at the next cookout. The bill is being handled by the executor of the estate, I said, my voice projecting to the corners of the room. As many of you know, my brother Terrence has informed me that he has been given sole control over Mama's affairs. He has the house, he has the accounts, and he has the responsibility. A murmur went through the room. But Clarissa, an older woman from the usher board said, you've always been the one. We thought you'd want to make sure your mother was sent off right." "I do," I said. "And I have full faith that my brother, who was so dedicated to Mama that he ensured her will was updated in her final hours, will show that same dedication to her final expenses. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some tea to prepare." I turned and walked back into the kitchen. My heart was racing. I was breaking the cardinal rule of the strong Black woman. I was refusing to be the safety net. I was letting the rope go, and I could feel the entire family structure beginning to wobble. 10 minutes later, the back door slammed. Terrence burst in, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He didn't care who was in the next room. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, leaning over the kitchen table. "Darnell just told me what you said. You're embarrassing me in front of the whole church." "You did that yourself, Terrence, when you asked me to pay for a funeral out of an estate you've locked me out of," I said, not looking up from the lemon I was slicing. "I told you, the money is frozen. I need you to cover it until probate clears." "And what happens if probate doesn't clear? What happens if the court finds that a will signed 24 hours before death by a non-lucid patient is invalid?" He went still. His eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you've made your bed, TJ. It's a mahogany bed with silk sheets, and it's worth about $400,000 in this market. But it's a cold bed when you don't have $22,000 to get the occupant into the ground." "You think you're so smart," he spat. "You think because you've got that degree and that pension that you can look down on me? Mama saw through you. She saw that you didn't love her. You just loved controlling her. You loved being the one she had to beg for help." The lie stung worse than any truth could have. Mama had never had to beg. I had anticipated her every need before she even knew she had it. "If that's what you need to believe to sleep at night, then so be it," I said. "But the funeral home needs the money by 10 a.m. tomorrow. If they don't have it, the service is canceled. The obituary is already in the paper. The buses are chartered for the seniors. Imagine the embarrassment then, Terrence. Imagine telling Aunt Bess and the bishop that the sole executor couldn't find the money to bury his own mother." "I'll sue you," he whispered. "I'll tell everyone you stole from her while you had power of attorney." "I kept every receipt, Terrence. Every single one. I have a ledger in my safe at home that tracks every penny of Mama's money and every dollar of my own that I spent on her. Can you say the same for the last 48 hours? I stood up, stepping close to him. I could smell the cheap gin on his breath. He had been drinking to steady his nerves. "Who is Sandra, Terrence? And why is she working for a firm that specializes in subprime home equity loans?" He flinched. It was a small movement, just a flicker in his jaw, but it was all the confirmation I needed. "She's a friend," he mumbled. "She was just helping me understand the paperwork." "I'm sure she was. Now get out of my kitchen. You have guests to entertain and a $22,000 problem to solve." He stared at me for a long beat, his eyes filled with a hatred that chilled my blood. Then he turned and stormed out, putting on his grieving son face the moment he crossed the threshold into the living room. I sat back down. My hands were freezing. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Marcus?" I said when the man answered. "Clarissa? Is that you? I heard about your mother. I'm so sorry." Marcus was my ex-husband. We had been divorced for 12 years, But before we were a disaster, he had been the best forensic accountant in the state of Georgia. I need a favor, Marcus, a big one. I need you to look into a property title, and I need you to do it tonight. Anything for you, Clarissa. You know that. What's the address? I gave him Mama's address. And Marcus? Yeah? Check for any recent liens, and check the name Sandra Vance. Give me 2 hours, he said. I hung up and looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the backyard. I saw Terrence out there, standing by the old oak tree, talking animatedly on his phone. He was pacing, his hand waving through the air. He looked desperate. I realized then that this wasn't just about a will. This was a heist. Terrence hadn't just changed the will. He had been gutting our family's history while I was holding Mama's hand and praying for her soul. I walked out into the living room. I put on my mask of grace. I hugged the aunts. I accepted the Tupperware containers of fried chicken and potato salad, and I listened to the stories of Miss Evelyn and her beautiful life. But I was watching the door. At 9 p.m., a man I didn't recognize walked in. He wasn't dressed for a wake. He was wearing a windbreaker and jeans. He didn't go to the casket to pay his respects. He went straight to Terrence. They whispered in the hallway for a few minutes. I saw Terrence hand him an envelope. The man nodded, looked around the room with a predatory glint in his eyes, and left. I followed him at a distance. I stood on the porch as he walked to his car. Before he got in, he took something out of his pocket, a small plastic sign. He hammered it into the edge of the lawn, just behind the hibiscus bushes where it couldn't be easily seen from the street, but would be visible to anyone pulling into the driveway. I waited until he drove off before I walked down the steps. I reached into the dirt and pulled the sign up. In bold, black letters it read, "Property in foreclosure. Public auction scheduled." The date on the bottom was 3 weeks away. My brother hadn't just stolen the house. He had already lost it. And then my phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Clarissa, call me now. It's worse than we thought. The will isn't the only thing he forged. Your name is on the new loan papers as a co-signer." I stood there in the dark, the foreclosure sign in one hand and my phone in the other. The weight of the world tried to settle on my shoulders again, expecting me to buckle, expecting me to find a way to save us all. But as I looked at the house that was currently filled with people who only loved me for what I could provide, I felt something inside me snap. Not like a twig, but like a lock. I wasn't going to save the house. I was going to burn his plans to the ground. I stood on the edge of the lawn, the property in foreclosure sign heavy in my hand. The crickets in the Georgia pines were loud, a rhythmic, buzzing chorus that sounded like a countdown. Inside the house, I could see the silhouettes of my family moving behind the lace curtains, laughing, eating, and mourning a version of my mother that none of them had actually cared for in her final, difficult years. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Marcus, tell me exactly what you found." Marcus's voice was low, filtered through the static of a long-distance connection and a decade of shared history. "Clarissa, I am looking at a digital filing from 3 weeks ago. A private equity firm called Vance and Associates, I'm guessing that's your Sandra's outfit, filed a deed of trust against your mother's property. It's a bridge loan for $300,000, high interest, short term." "And the cosigner?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's you, Clarissa. Clarissa Lynn Sterling. There's a scanned copy of your driver's license and what looks like a very clean electronic signature. They used your credit score to secure the rate. Your mother's house is the collateral, but your personal assets are the guarantee if the house doesn't cover the balance at auction. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. Terrence hadn't just stolen the inheritance. He had shackled me to his debt. He had walked into my mother's sick room, waited for me to go to work or fall asleep in the chair by her bed, and gone through my purse. He'd photographed my ID. He'd probably used my own iPad to forge my signature on some predatory app while I was in the next room praying for Mama's peace. What's the status of the loan, Marcus? In default. He missed the first 2 payments, the interest-only origination fees. That's why they've moved to foreclosure so fast. These companies don't want the payments, Clarissa. They want the dirt. That lot is worth more than the house to developers. Can you prove I didn't sign it? Eventually, but the funeral is tomorrow, Clarissa. The moment that will is read and Terrence is officially recognized as the executor, he'll have the legal standing to finalize the sale before we can even get a court date for the forgery. He's moving at light speed because he knows he only has a small window of chaos to hide in. I understand, I said. Thank you, Marcus. Don't tell anyone we spoke, especially not Simone. Clarissa, Marcus hesitated. Don't try to fix this by yourself. This isn't a school budget meeting. This is criminal. I know what it is, Marcus. It's the end of an era. I hung up and tucked the foreclosure sign under my arm, hiding it beneath my blazer. I walked back toward the house. My steps felt different now. The weight wasn't on my shoulders anymore. It was in my hands. And a weight in your hands can be used as a tool or a weapon. I entered through the kitchen. The smell of fried catfish and collard greens was overwhelming. Aunt Bess was standing at the stove, stirring a pot with a long wooden spoon. She looked at me, her eyes darting to the bulge under my jacket. You okay, baby? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just getting some air, Aunt Bess, I said, my voice perfectly level. Where's Terrence? He's in the den with the deacons. They're talking about the eulogy. He wants to make sure the bishop mentions how he was the pillar Mama leaned on in her sunset years. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. A pillar. That's a lovely image. I walked toward the den. I didn't knock. I pushed the double doors open and stepped inside. The room was dim, filled with the scent of expensive cigars. Terrence had clearly raided Daddy's old humidor. 3 deacons from the Ebenezer Baptist Church sat in the leather armchairs, nodding solemnly as Terrence spoke. He was standing by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing toward a framed photo of Mama. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize the word sacrifice, Terrence was saying. Because that's what these last years were. A sacrifice of my own ambitions to ensure she was never alone. The deacons murmured their approval. A good son, one said. A blessing to his mother. Terrence, I said, my voice cutting through the smoky air like a cold blade. I need a word, privately. The deacons looked up, startled. Terrence's face hardened. Clarissa, we're in the middle of something important here. Can it wait? No, I said. I looked at the deacons. Gentlemen, please excuse us. I'm sure you have more plates to finish in the dining room. There is a way a school principal speaks that brooks no argument. It is the voice of the woman who knows the rules better than those who break them. The deacon stood up, offering awkward nods, and scurried out of the room. Terrence waited until the door clicked shut. You've got a lot of nerve, coming in here and embarrassing me in front of the church elders. First the funeral home, now this? I didn't answer him. I walked to the mahogany desk. Daddy's desk, and laid the property in foreclosure sign flat on the blotter. Terrence's face went from indignant to ghostly pale in 3 seconds. He looked at the sign, then at me, then back at the sign. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "I took it off the lawn. The man you met with earlier hammered it in while you were busy playing the good son inside. He was very efficient." "Clarissa, I can explain." "No, you can't," I said, sitting down in Daddy's chair. I leaned back, looking at him. "You forged my name, Terrence. You used my credit, my reputation, and my mother's house to take a $300,000 loan that you've already gambled away or spent on that girl Sandra. And now the house is in foreclosure, and the funeral bill is due at 10 a.m. "It was a business investment," he hissed, stepping closer. "I was going to flip a property in the Heights. The market dipped, that's all. It was just a temporary setback. If you just paid the funeral bill, I would have had time to move some things around." "Move what things around, Terrence? There is nothing left. You've hollowed this family out from the inside. You sat by Mama's bed while she was dying, not to comfort her, but to make sure you could guide her hand to sign a will that gave you the rights to finish the job." "She wanted me to have it," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She knew you didn't need it." "You've got everything, Clarissa. You've always had everything. I just wanted a chance to be the one on top for once." "On top of what? A pile of debt? A stolen legacy?" I shook my head. "You aren't a man, Terrence. You're a termite. You've been eating the foundation of this house for years, and now you're surprised the roof is falling in." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his eyes darting toward the door. "Go to the police? On the night before our mother's funeral? You think the family is going to thank you for that? You think the bishop is going to let you sit in the front row while your brother is in handcuffs?" "That's the strong black woman trap, isn't it?" I said softly. "The idea that I have to protect the family's image at the cost of my own soul. That I have to swallow your crimes so our name stays clean in the church bulletin." I stood up. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For 20 years, I had been the guardian of the Sterling name. I had covered Terrence's bad checks, I had paid for the repairs, I had kept the secrets. And all it had bought me was a brother who felt entitled to destroy me. "I'm not going to the police, Terrence. Not tonight." A look of immense relief washed over his face. "I knew you'd be reasonable, sis. I knew you'd see the bigger picture. We'll figure it out. We can take another loan, maybe against your house." "You didn't let me finish," I said. "I'm not going to the police tonight because I'm busy. I have a funeral to attend. But I am not paying the bill, and I am not signing any more documents, and I am certainly not saving this house." "If you don't save the house, you lose your credit. You lose your guarantee." "No," I said. "If the house goes to auction, the debt is attached to the estate. And since you are the sole executor and the sole beneficiary of that estate, the legal nightmare will be yours to navigate. As for the forgery, Marcus has already flagged the loan. The moment you try to finalize the sale of this property, the title company will hit a red flag that will trigger an automatic fraud investigation. I won't have to call the police. The bank will do it for me." "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice was shaking. "Try me. I'm going to go out there now. I'm going to eat a piece of Aunt Bess's pound cake, and I'm going to tell everyone how much you're looking forward to handling all the arrangements tomorrow. I walked toward the door, then stopped. Oh, and Terrence? I'd call Mr. Montgomery at the funeral home if I were you. He doesn't take business investments as collateral. He takes cash. And if he doesn't have it by 10 a.m., he's going to call the church to cancel the flowers. Imagine that headline. Sterling family matriarch held in cold storage because son spent the burial money on a paralegal. I walked out of the den, leaving him standing in the dark with the foreclosure sign. The rest of the wake was a blur of polite smiles and suppressed rage. I sat in the living room, a cup of tea in my lap, watching my family. I realized I was looking at them as if from a great distance. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel responsible for their comfort. If the tea was cold, I didn't get up to microwave it. If the conversation lagged, I didn't provide a story to fill the gap. I just sat. I observed. At 11 p.m., the last of the guests filtered out. Aunt Bess stayed behind to help clean up, but I told her to go home and rest. You sure, Clarissa? You look weary to the bone. I'm more than weary, Aunt Bess. I'm finished. But I'll be fine. Once the house was quiet, I went upstairs to my mother's bedroom. It was untouched. The hospital bed had been removed, but the scent of her perfume, white linen and lavender, still clung to the curtains. I sat on the edge of her bed. I looked at the nightstand. There was a small, leather-bound Bible there. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Near the back, I found a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a will. It was a letter, written in my mother's elegant, old-fashioned script, dated 3 years ago. My dearest Clarissa, it began. I know I am hard on you. I know I ask for everything and give the praise to your brother. Please understand, my brave girl, that I do it because I know you can stand. Terrence is made of glass. If I don't give him everything, he will shatter. But you are the foundation. A foundation doesn't need to be decorated. It just needs to be strong. I read the words again. A foundation doesn't need to be decorated. She hadn't ignored my sacrifices. She had weaponized them. She had decided that because I was strong, I didn't need love. Because I was capable, I didn't need protection. She had sacrificed my happiness on the altar of my brother's weakness, and she had expected me to be proud of the burden. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my stomach. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I'm not a foundation anymore, Mama, I whispered to the empty room. I'm the storm. I went down to the kitchen and made a final check of the doors. As I passed the basement stairs, I heard a sound, a muffled, rhythmic thumping. I frowned and opened the basement door. The light was on. I walked down the wooden steps. There, in the center of the unfinished basement, was Terrence. He had a sledgehammer in his hands. He was wildly swinging it at the brick foundation of the house, screaming in a low, guttural tone. "Where is it?" he yelled, swinging again. "She said it was here. She said Daddy hid it in the wall." He was looking for Daddy's emergency stash. A family legend that my father had hidden a box of gold coins or cash in the masonry of the house for a rainy day. I watched him for a moment. He looked insane. His suit was covered in brick dust, his tie was discarded on the floor, and his eyes were bloodshot. "There is no money in the walls, Terrence," I said from the bottom step. He spun around, the sledgehammer held awkwardly. "You're lying. She told me. She said if things ever got bad, the house would provide. She said the foundation was the key." I looked at the damage he had done. He had cracked the main support pillar, the very thing Mama said I was. "The house is providing exactly what you deserve, Terrence," I said. "Silence and dust." I turned and walked back up the stairs, locking the basement door behind me. I didn't care if he spent the whole night digging. He was searching for a ghost to save him from a ghost. I went to my car and drove to a hotel near the airport. I didn't want to be in that house when the sun came up. I didn't want to be the one who found him when he realized there was no gold. I checked into a room, showered until the smell of the wake was gone, and lay down on the crisp white sheets. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. It was Mr. Montgomery from the funeral home. "Miss Sterling? I'm sorry to call so early, but your brother is here. He's hysterical. He's trying to pay the balance with a collection of old coins and a deed that he says is worth millions. I've had to call security." "Is the service still on, Mr. Montgomery?" I asked, my voice calm. "Not unless the bill is settled in 30 minutes, ma'am. The drivers are refusing to start the hearses." "I see," I said. "Then I suppose the Sterling family is about to have a very public mourning. Thank you for letting me know." I hung up. I got out of bed and began to dress. I put on my best suit, a sharp charcoal gray wool. I did my makeup with precision. I put on my pearls. I wasn't going to pay the bill, but I was definitely going to the funeral. I wanted to be there to watch the foundation finally crumble. I drove to the church in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Savannah was waking up, the Spanish moss draped over the oaks like tattered lace, the morning mist rising off the marshes. To anyone else, it was a beautiful Saturday morning. To the Sterling family, it was the day the mask was slated to slip. I pulled into the parking lot of Ebenezer Baptist 30 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. The parking lot should have been a hive of activity. Ushers in white gloves, the flower van unloading wreaths, the hearse idling near the side entrance. Instead, the lot was eerily quiet. 2 black limousines sat empty near the curb. A group of deacons stood in a tight circle near the front steps, their voices low and urgent. And there, standing by the side door, was Mr. Montgomery. He looked up as my car approached, his face a mask of professional regret. I stepped out of the car. The click of my heels on the asphalt sounded like a countdown. "Miss Sterling," Mr. Montgomery said, stepping forward to meet me. "I've been trying to reach you." "I was in transit, Mr. Montgomery," I said smoothly. "Is there a problem? I see the hearse hasn't arrived." "The hearse is still at the funeral home," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Along with your mother. My board of directors was very clear, Clarissa. After the incident this morning with your brother, they've refused to release the body or the staff until the balance is settled in full, with guaranteed funds." "I see." "He came to my office at dawn," Montgomery continued, shaking his head. "He had a velvet bag full of old silver dollars and a stack of papers he claimed were bearer bonds for a tech company that went bankrupt in 2004. He was screaming about hidden treasure and foundations. It was a scene, Clarissa. He nearly broke my secretary's desk." "Where is he now?" "He's inside the sanctuary. He's trying to convince the bishop to start the service anyway. He told the family that the hearse was stuck in traffic due to an accident on the bridge." I looked at the church doors. Members of the community were starting to arrive. Women in wide-brimmed hats, men in their Sunday best, all coming to pay their respects to the woman who had been the backbone of the neighborhood. They had no idea there was no casket inside. They were walking into an empty performance. "Clarissa!" I turned to see Aunt Bess hurrying toward us, her face flushed under her purple hat. "Clarissa, what is going on? The ushers are saying the flowers haven't been delivered, and I just saw the caterer packing his truck back up at the fellowship hall." I took a deep breath. This was the moment. The moment where the old Clarissa would have pulled out her phone, called the bank, and authorized a wire transfer to save the day. My heart hammered against my ribs, urging me to do it, to protect Mama's dignity, to save the family from the biting tongues of the gossips. But then I felt the folded letter in my pocket. A foundation doesn't need to be decorated. "Aunt Bess," I said, my voice clear enough for the deacons to hear. "You'll have to ask the executor. Terrence is handling all the financial arrangements. He assured me he had everything under control." "But he's in there sweating through his suit and talking nonsense," Bess hissed. "He's telling people you're the reason the money is tied up." "He's lying," I said simply. I walked past her, past Mr. Montgomery, and through the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. The air inside was cool and smelled of furniture polish and old hymnals. At the front of the church, near the empty space where the casket should have been, Terrence was pacing. He looked like a man who had been through a war. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were wild, and there was a dark stain of sweat down the back of his suit jacket. Bishop Walker was standing at the pulpit, looking down at Terrence with a mixture of pity and growing irritation. "Terrence," the bishop's voice boomed through the quiet room. "We cannot have a funeral without a body. It's not a service, it's a memorial. And that's not what the program says." "It's coming!" Terrence shouted, his voice cracking. "It's just a delay! My sister!" He stopped when he saw me walking down the center aisle. He pointed a trembling finger. "There she is. There's the one with the money. Clarissa, tell them! Tell them you're going to fix it!" The few relatives who had arrived early turned in their pews. Cousin Darnell, the deacons, the head of the usher board, all eyes landed on me. The weight of their collective expectation was a physical pressure, a suffocating heat. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a savior. I stopped at the front row. I didn't look at Terrence. I looked at the bishop. "Good morning, Bishop," I said, my voice calm and resonant. "Miss Sterling," the bishop said, leaning forward. "Your brother tells us there has been a banking error regarding your mother's estate. He says you have the means to rectify it." "My brother is correct that I have the means," I said. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the pews. Terrence's shoulders dropped 3 inches. He actually smirked at me. "But," I continued, "my brother is the sole executor of this estate. He went to great lengths, legal and otherwise, to ensure that I had no authority over my mother's assets or her final arrangements. He chose this path. He chose the responsibility." I turned to face the room. "I am here today as a mourning daughter, nothing more. I have no access to the estate funds, and I have no legal standing to pay a bill that belongs to the executor. If there is no service today, it is because the man who changed the will yesterday failed to prepare for the reality of today." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of 100 years of family traditions snapping in two. Clarissa, you can't be serious. Cousin Darnell stood up. This is your mother. You're going to let her stay at the funeral home over a legal technicality? It's not a technicality, Darnell, I said, turning to him. It's a boundary. For 30 years, I have paid for every mistake, every whim, and every business venture this family has produced. I have been the strong Black woman you all leaned on until my own back was nearly broken. And while I was doing that, my brother was forging my name on loans and stealing the very house I was paying to maintain. A gasp went up from the pews. He did what? Aunt Bess shouted from the back. He forged my signature on a $300,000 loan, I said, my voice growing stronger. He put our mother's house into foreclosure, and he did it all while she was taking her last breaths. So no, I will not write a check for $22,000 to cover his theft. I will not be the safety net for a man who tried to push me off a cliff. Terrence lunged at me. You're lying. You're just jealous. You're trying to ruin me. He didn't get far. Two of the younger deacons stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. They looked at him now with disgust. The good son mask hadn't just slipped. It had dissolved. Bishop, I said, turning back to the pulpit, I suggest we have a moment of silent prayer for my mother. And then, I suggest you ask the executor to leave your church. He has business to attend to at the funeral home, and I suspect he'll be having business with the district attorney shortly after. Bishop Walker looked at Terrence, then at me. He had known our family for 40 years. He had seen me work myself to the bone, while Terrence played the part of the charming rogue. Terrence, the bishop said, his voice cold as stone. Go. Now. Bishop, listen. Go! The bishop thundered. And don't come back until you've made right what you've made wrong. Terrence looked around the room. He saw no allies. Even Darnell was looking at the floor. Terrence's face twisted into something ugly, something primal. He spat on the floor near the pulpit, turned, and ran out the side door. The sanctuary was dead silent. I sat down in the front row. I folded my hands in my lap. I felt a strange, hollow peace. The scandal would be the talk of Savannah for a decade. The sterling grace was gone. The reputation I had spent my life building was in tatters. And I didn't care. Miss Sterling, the bishop said softly, coming down from the pulpit. He stood in front of me. What would you like us to do? Nothing, Bishop, I said. The service is canceled. I'll be making my own arrangements for a private burial later this week. For now, I think everyone should go home. Clarissa, Aunt Bess came down the aisle and sat next to me. She put her arm around me. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask me to fix it. I'm so sorry. I didn't know he had gone that far. I didn't either, Bess, but I know now. I stood up. I walked out of the church, my head held high. I didn't look back at the empty space where the casket should have been. My mother wasn't in that church. She wasn't at the funeral home. She was in the letter in my pocket. She was in the cracks of the house. I got into my car and drove. I didn't go to the hotel. I didn't go to the house. I drove out to the coast, to a small, quiet stretch of beach where the Atlantic met the Georgia shore. I sat on the sand in my charcoal suit and my pearls. I took off my shoes. I watched the tide come in. My phone buzzed incessantly. Texts from cousins, calls from the funeral home, alerts from my bank. I turned it off. I realized then that for the first time in 60 years, No one knew where I was. No one was asking me for a loan. No one was asking me to solve a crisis. No one was expecting me to be strong. I was just Clarissa. I stayed there until the sun began to set. When I finally turned my phone back on, there was one message that caught my eye. It wasn't from a family member. It was from Marcus. Clarissa, the bank just called. Terrence tried to flee the state in a car he bought with the loan money. He didn't make it past the county line. He crashed the car, Clarissa. He's in the hospital. And the police are there waiting for him. But that's not why I'm calling. I held my breath. The title company found something else when they did the deep dive into the house. Your father didn't just leave the house to your mother. He set up a secondary trust that was supposed to trigger upon her death. A trust that Terrence's forged will can't touch. It's an insurance policy, Clarissa. A big one. And you're the only beneficiary. I looked out at the water. The gold coins Terrence had been looking for weren't in the walls. My father, the master carpenter, knew how to build a foundation. He knew that the only way to protect a woman like me was to hide the treasure where the termites couldn't find it. I stood up and brushed the sand from my skirt. The weight was gone. The debt was settled. But the story wasn't over. I had a brother to visit in the hospital, and I had a house to take back. The hospital room smelled of scorched rubber and industrial-grade disinfectant. It was a familiar scent, one that had defined the last 6 months of my life. But this time, the occupant of the bed wasn't a fading queen. It was a broken jester. Terrence lay there, his legs suspended in a complex pulley system, his face a mosaic of purple bruises and white surgical tape. A thin plastic tube ran from his nose, and the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only thing filling the silence. Outside the door, a deputy from the Chatham County Sheriff's Office sat on a folding chair, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. I stood at the foot of the bed, my hands folded over the handle of my handbag. I hadn't changed out of my funeral suit. The charcoal wool felt like armor. Terrence's eyes fluttered open. It took him a moment to find me, to focus through the haze of whatever painkillers they had him on. When he did, his first instinct wasn't shame. It was a plea. "Clarissa," he croaked, his voice thick with phlegm. The car is totaled. I don't know what happened. The rain, the tires just gave out." "You weren't supposed to be on the road, Terrence," I said. "You were supposed to be at our mother's funeral." But then again, there was no funeral, was there? He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the dried blood on his cheek. "I was trying to get to Atlanta, to see a man about the loan. I was going to fix it. I swear, sis, I was going to fix everything." "With what? The silver dollars you tried to pass off to Mr. Montgomery? Or the $300,000 you already spent?" I stepped closer, the heels of my shoes clicking softly on the linoleum. "You crashed a $60,000 Mercedes that you bought with my credit. You fled the scene of a financial crime, and you did it while your mother was sitting in a refrigerated locker because you couldn't find the decency to prioritize her dignity over your greed." "I did it for us," he whispered, the lie so practiced it almost sounded like a prayer. "To build something, to finally be the man Daddy wanted me to be." "Don't you ever mention our father," I said, my voice dropping into that low, vibrating register that used to make the most hardened high school seniors go silent in the hallway. Our father spent 40 years with sawdust in his lungs so his children would never have to beg. He didn't build this family for you to arson it for a weekend in Atlanta with a paralegal. Terrence flinched. Where is she? Where's Sandra? She was supposed to meet me at the hospital. Sandra Vance is currently being questioned by the fraud department of the bank she helped you rob, I said. It turns out she has a history of helping grieving men find their way into subprime debt. But unlike you, Terrence, she was smart enough to keep her name off the documents. She's going to walk. You, however, are handcuffed to this bed. I pulled a chair over and sat down. I didn't lean in. I didn't offer the comfort of my touch. I just sat there, watching him breathe. The house is in foreclosure, Terrence. The notice is public. By Monday, every neighbor on that street will know you've lost the Sterling home. You have to save it, he sobbed, his chest heaving under the thin hospital gown. You have the trust. Marcus told you about the trust, didn't he? I heard him talking on the phone. Use that money, Clarissa. Pay off the loan. Save the house. For Mama. I leaned back, a small, cold smile touching my lips. The trust. You knew about it all along, didn't you? Daddy told me when I was 20, he confessed, the words spilling out in a rush of desperation. He said it was the lifeboat. He said if the family ever hit a storm, the trust would be there. I thought if I got the house and the accounts, the trust would just come with it. I didn't know he locked it. I didn't know he made it so only you could touch the principal. He didn't just lock it, Terrence. He protected it. He knew exactly who you were. He knew that the moment he and Mama were gone, you'd come for the foundation. So he buried the treasure where a termite couldn't find it. Please, he begged, don't let them take the house. It's all I have. No, I said, standing up. It's all you took. And now, it's gone. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've spent my entire life being the safety net for your failures. I've paid for your lawyers, your cars, your failed businesses, and your setbacks. I've done it because Mama asked me to, because she believed that being strong meant carrying the weak until your own bones turned to powder. But Mama is gone, and the only person I'm responsible for now is the woman you tried to ruin. I walked toward the door. Clarissa, you can't just leave me here. I'm your brother. I stopped, my hand on the heavy steel door. I looked back at him, this man-child who had hollowed out my family and expected me to fill the hole with my own life's work. Being a brother is a verb, Terrence. It requires action. It requires loyalty. You haven't been my brother in a very long time. You've just been a debt I've been paying on. And today, the account is closed. I walked out. I didn't look at the deputy. I didn't look at the nurse's station. I walked straight to the elevator and down to the parking garage. As I drove back toward the neighborhood, my phone rang. It was the landline at Mama's house. I had forwarded the calls to my cell weeks ago so she wouldn't be bothered by telemarketers. I answered it. Hello? Clarissa, is that you? The voice was high-pitched, frantic. It was Cousin Darnell. You need to get down here, right now. Darnell, I told everyone to go home. The wake is over. They didn't go home, Clarissa. They're here. Half the family is at the house. They found the foreclosure sign you hid in the den. They're starting to take things. Darnell's wife is in the kitchen right now, boxing up the silver. She says if the bank is taking the house, the family should get what's left before the government gets it. I felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury. The vultures hadn't even waited for the body to be cold. They were stripping the carcass. Who else is there, Darnell? Aunt Bess is trying to stop them, but they aren't listening. They're saying since you won't pay the funeral bill, you've forfeited your right to say what happens to the property. They're calling you selfish, Clarissa. They're saying you're letting the house go just to spite TJ. I'll be there in 10 minutes, I said. And Darnell? Yeah? Tell your wife to put the silver back, or she'll be meeting the same deputy I just left at the hospital. I hung up and stepped on the gas. When I turned onto the street, I saw the cars. They were lined up along the curb like a funeral procession for a life that wasn't even over yet. The lights were blazing in every window of the house. I saw shadows moving behind the curtains, people I had shared Thanksgiving meals with, people I had sent graduation checks to, people I had loved. I parked my car in the middle of the street, blocking the driveway. I didn't rush. I took a moment to check my reflection in the rearview mirror. My pearls were straight. My hair was perfect. I looked like the principal of a school where a riot was about to be quelled. I walked up the porch steps. The front door was wide open. Inside, the house was a crime scene of greed. Cousin Darnell's wife, Sheila, was in the dining room. She had Mama's antique crystal punch bowl in her hands. My second cousin, Leroy, was struggling to get the flat-screen TV off the wall in the den. There were boxes stacked in the foyer, boxes filled with books, linens, and the small, precious things that make a house a home. Aunt Bess was sitting on the stairs, her head in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red from crying. I tried, Clarissa. I told them this was shameful. I didn't say a word. I walked into the dining room. Sheila didn't even look up. You should have paid the bill, Clarissa, Sheila said, her voice tight with a fake performative sorrow. Now look at this. The bank's going to lock the doors on Monday. We're just making sure the Sterling heirlooms stay in the family. It's what Evelyn would have wanted. I walked over to her. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't raise my voice. Sheila, I said softly. She looked up, a defensive sneer on her face. Don't you start with me. You've got your big house and your pension. You don't need... I reached out and took the punch bowl from her hands. I didn't tug. I simply took it, with a grip that left no room for negotiation. I set it down on the table. Get out, I said. Excuse me? I said, get out. Every single one of you. I turned and walked to the foyer, my voice rising just enough to carry into the den and the kitchen. Listen to me. Every person in this house who does not have Sterling on their birth certificate has 30 seconds to put down whatever they are holding and exit through the front door. The house went silent. Leroy appeared in the doorway of the den, the TV remote still in his hand. Clarissa, be reasonable. We're just trying to help. You aren't helping, Leroy. You're looting. This house is currently under a legal stay of foreclosure due to an active fraud investigation. That means everything in it is evidence. If you walk out that door with so much as a teaspoon, I will personally see to it that the police stop your car at the end of the block. You wouldn't call the law on your own blood, Sheila snapped, walking into the foyer. Try me, Sheila. I just spent the last hour at the hospital, watching my brother being guarded by a deputy for the very same thing you're doing right now. I have no blood, left to protect. I only have my peace, and you are disturbing it. I looked at my watch. 25 seconds. They looked at each other. They saw the coldness in my eyes, a coldness they hadn't seen in the 30 years I had been the family's ATM and emotional dumping ground. They realized the strong Black woman they had relied on had finally found the one thing she was stronger than: her desire to be liked by them. One by one, they dropped the boxes. They avoided my gaze as they shuffled past me and out onto the porch. Leroy put the remote on the banister. Sheila didn't even say goodbye. Within 2 minutes, the house was empty of everyone except me and Aunt Bess. Bess stood up, wiping her eyes. Lord, Clarissa, I've never seen you like that. You looked like your grandmother when she used to stand down the debt collectors. I'm tired, Aunt Bess, I said, leaning against the wall. I'm so tired of being the only one who cares about the foundation. What are you going to do about the house? The bank really is coming, isn't it? I looked around the foyer. The walls were scarred where Leroy had bumped them with the furniture. The air was heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap perfume. The bank is coming for Terrence's debt, I said, but they aren't coming for the house. How? You said the trust was only for you. It is. And the trust isn't just money, Bess. My father was a carpenter, remember? He knew that a house is only as good as the land it sits on. He didn't own the house in his name. He owned the land through a separate holding company. The house was built on a long-term lease. Terrence forged a deed for the structure, but the land? The land belongs to the trust. And the lease is in default because the tenant, the estate, tried to use it as collateral without the landlord's permission. Aunt Bess frowned. In plain English, baby? In plain English, the bank can have the bricks and the shingles, but they can't touch the ground they're sitting on. And since you can't have a house without land, the bank is about to find out they bought a very expensive pile of nothing. I'm going to buy the house back from the bank for pennies on the dollar once they realize their title insurance won't cover a house built on air. Bess started to laugh, a deep, wheezing sound that turned into a cough. Oh, Evelyn would be so proud. She always said you were the only one who could outthink a man with a checkbook. I don't want her pride, Bess. I just want her to rest. I walked Bess to her car and watched her drive away. Then I went back inside and locked the door. I walked from room to room, turning off the lights. I stopped in the kitchen and looked at the silver punch bowl Sheila had tried to take. I picked it up and carried it to the basement door. I went down the stairs, past the support pillar Terrence had tried to destroy with a sledgehammer. I walked to the far corner of the basement, where a small, unassuming wooden cabinet stood. I opened the cabinet. Inside were my father's old tools, his levels, his planes, his hammers. They were clean, oiled, and ready for work. Underneath the tool chest, I found the small metal box Marcus had told me about. I had the key in my pocket. I opened it. There were no gold coins. There was no cash. There was a single, handwritten deed from 1982. It was a deed for a small plot of land in the mountains of North Carolina, near a town I'd never heard of. And attached to it was a life insurance policy in my name, one that had been quietly accumulating interest for 40 years. But there was something else. A small, black and white photograph of me when I was 6 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders. On the back, he had written, "To my Clarissa, the one who will keep the line. Don't build for them. build for yourself. I sat on the cold basement floor, and for the first time since my mother died, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I finally felt seen. My father hadn't expected me to be the foundation for everyone else. He had wanted me to be the foundation for my own life. I spent the night in the house. I slept in Mama's bed, draped in her lavender scent, but I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a woman who was finally waking up. The next morning, Sunday, I didn't go to church. I went to the funeral home. I met Mr. Montgomery in his office. He looked surprised to see me. "Miss Sterling, I heard about the accident and the police. I assume the service is off indefinitely?" "No, Mr. Montgomery," I said, placing a cashier's check on his desk. The amount was for $30,000, the full balance, plus a significant inconvenience fee for his staff. "The service is on. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Private. No church, no ushers, no friends of the family. Just a graveside service at the Sterling plot." "And the guests?" "There are no guests," I said. "Just me and the woman who raised me. I want her in the ground before the sun reaches the trees." "And understand," he said, his voice respectful. "And your brother?" "My brother is exactly where he needs to be. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a house to dismantle." I spent the rest of Sunday clearing the house. Not the furniture, but the clutter. I threw away the reminders of Terrence's greed. I packed Mama's porcelain birds into sturdy boxes. I took the family photos and put them in my car. By the time the sun went down, the house felt empty. It felt like a shell. I was standing on the porch looking out at the neighborhood when a car pulled up. It was a black SUV. Sandra Vance stepped out. She wasn't wearing her club dress. She was wearing a sharp, professional suit. She walked up the steps, her neon nails clicking against her designer bag. "Clarissa," she said, her voice devoid of the nasal whine she'd used before. "I think we need to talk." "I don't talk to associates, Sandra, especially not those who are under investigation." "The investigation is a formality," she said, leaning against the railing. "The bank knows they can't prove I knew the signatures were forged, but they also know they're in a mess with the land lease. Your father was very clever. Most people don't look at the ground when they're buying the roof." "What do you want?" "I want to make a deal. I have the files Terrence tried to hide, the ones that show he wasn't just gambling. He was being blackmailed by someone in your own family." I froze. "Blackmailed by who?" Sandra smiled, a cold, predatory look that made me realize Terrence hadn't been her partner. He had been her prey. "Who do you think has been whispering in his ear for 20 years, Clarissa? Who do you think told him about the hidden treasure in the walls just to watch him tear the house apart?" She stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "It wasn't me. It was the person who's been living in your shadow since you were a child." She handed me a manila envelope. "The proof is in there. I'm leaving town tonight. I don't like to be around when the foundations start to crack. Consider this a professional courtesy from one woman who knows how to survive to another." She walked back to her car and drove away. I looked at the envelope. My hands were shaking. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it. The first thing I saw was a series of bank statements. They weren't Terrence's. They belonged to a joint account held by Cousin Darnell and his wife, Sheila. And the second thing I saw was a letter. It was a copy of the one my mother had written me, the one that said, "A foundation doesn't need to be decorated." But on this copy, there were notes in the margins. Notes in a handwriting I recognized instantly. She thinks she's so strong. Let's see how much weight she can carry before she breaks. Tell TJ about the gold in the basement. He'll do the rest. The handwriting belonged to Aunt Bess, the woman who had sat on my stairs and cried with me, the woman who had told me to keep the line, the woman who had been my only ally in the storm. She hadn't been the anchor. She had been the wind. I sat in the dark kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I realized then that the betrayal wasn't just a brother's greed or a mother's coldness. It was a deep, generational rot that ran through the very heart of the Sterling family. I picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Marcus?" I said when he answered. "Clarissa? What is it? You sound different." "I need you to find me a lawyer, Marcus. Not an accountant. A shark. I'm not just taking the house back." I looked at the letter on the table. "I'm taking everything." The sun rose over the Bonaventure Cemetery with a cruel, indifferent beauty. The mist clung to the gray angel statues, and the scent of damp earth and salt air was heavy. At 9 a.m. sharp, the black hearse pulled up to the Sterling family plot. There were no following limousines, no floral vans, no line of cars stretching back to the highway. Just me. I stood by the open grave, my black veil pinned back, my hands gloved and steady. Mr. Montgomery and 4 of his silent, somber assistants stood at a respectful distance. "Would you like a few moments, Miss Sterling?" Mr. Montgomery asked, his voice barely a ripple in the morning air. "No, Mr. Montgomery," I said. "Let's begin." There was no bishop, no choir, no one to sing "His Eye is on the Sparrow" or talk about Mama's unbreakable spirit. I had spent 50 years listening to people talk about my family. I didn't need to hear it today. As the mahogany casket, the one I had paid for twice over now, was lowered into the Georgia clay, I didn't feel the crushing weight of grief. I felt a sense of completion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the copy of the letter Aunt Bess had annotated, the one that treated my strength as a defect to be exploited. I dropped it into the grave. I watched it flutter down and land on the lid of the casket. "You were wrong, Mama," I whispered, the words intended only for the earth. A foundation isn't just something you build on. It's the only part of the house that survives the fire. I turned and walked away before the first shovelful of dirt hit the wood. I didn't look back. I had a different kind of service to attend. I drove across town to the historic district, to a house that was even older and grander than Mama's. It was a white Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden of hydrangeas that looked like blue clouds. Aunt Bess's house. For my entire life, this had been my sanctuary. When my marriage was failing, I came here. When the school board was breathing down my neck, I came here. Bess was the one who listened. She was the one who told me that I was doing a good job when no one else would. She was the sweet sister, the one who didn't demand, didn't judge, and always had a pot of tea ready. I parked the car and sat for a moment, looking at the house. I realized now that every piece of advice she had ever given me was a brick in a wall she was building around me. "Don't worry about the house, Clarissa. TJ just needs a place to land." "You're so strong, baby. You don't need to worry about the inheritance like he does. Keep the peace, Clarissa, for the family name. Every word had been a sedative, designed to keep me quiet while she manipulated the weak brother into doing her dirty work. I got out of the car. I didn't knock. I used the spare key she had given me 10 years ago, the one she thought was a symbol of our bond. The house smelled of cinnamon and expensive floor wax. I heard the clink of a spoon against a china cup in the sunroom. Clarissa? Is that you, sugar? Bess's voice drifted through the hallway, warm and inviting. I thought I heard your car. Come in, baby. I've just made some ginger tea. I know you must be exhausted after that terrible morning at the church. I walked into the sunroom. Bess was sitting in a wicker chair, draped in a silk robe, a book of palms in her lap. She looked like a portrait of grandmotherly grace. She looked up and smiled, but the smile faltered when she saw my face. She saw the charcoal suit. She saw the gloves. She saw the manila envelope in my hand. How was the service? She asked, her voice dropping an octave. She didn't ask where it was. She knew I had moved it. It was quiet, Bess, just the way a burial should be when the family has already buried their honor. I walked to the table and set the envelope down next to her tea. Sandra Vance says hello, I said. Bess didn't move. She didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't gasp. She just stared at it as if it were a coiled snake. The mask of the sweet aunt didn't slip. It simply hardened into something sharp and ancient. Sandra is a deeply untrustworthy young woman, Clarissa, Bess said, her voice perfectly calm. I hope you didn't pay her for whatever lies are in that folder. She didn't want money, Bess. She wanted a head start. She knew that once I found out about the blackmail, I wouldn't stop until I found the source of the funds, and the source of the funds is right here. I pulled out the bank statements. For 5 years, Terrence has been transferring consulting fees from Mama's accounts into a shell company called BS Heritage Holdings. I assume the BS stands for Bessie Sterling? Or perhaps it's just a more honest description of your character. Bess picked up her tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. Terrence was a mess, Clarissa. He owed people money, bad people. I was simply a middleman, helping him move funds so they wouldn't be seized by his creditors. I was protecting the Sterling assets. You weren't protecting assets, Bess. You were harvesting them. You told him about the gold in the walls because you knew he'd destroy the house looking for it. And once the house was a wreck, you knew the bank would move in, the land lease would trigger, and you, as the secondary trustee of the original 1982 deed, would be the one to save the property by buying it back for pennies. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across her. You wanted the land, Bess. You've always hated that my father left the ground to Mama instead of you. You've spent 40 years playing the supportive sister while you waited for her to die so you could take back what you thought was yours. Bess set her cup down. The china rattled just slightly. Your father was a fool, Clarissa. He was a carpenter who thought he was a king. That land was Sterling land long before he married into this family and started putting his name on things. I am a Sterling. You are a Sterling. He was an interloper. He was the man who built the roof you're sitting under, I said. And he was the man who saw you coming. I pulled out the last document, the one from the metal box in the basement. He didn't just leave me the land, Bess. He left me a right of first refusal on any property owned by the Sterling siblings, including this house. And he added a clause, a morality clause for the trust. It states that if any trustee is found to be engaged in the financial exploitation of another family member, their share of the trust is automatically dissolved and transferred to the victim. Bess's eyes widened. For the first time, I saw the fear. Not the fear of a woman who had lost her niece, but the fear of a woman who was about to lose her fortress. "You can't prove exploitation," she hissed. "It was all Terrence. He's the one in the hospital. He's the one who forged the names." "He did, and he's going to testify against you, Bess. In exchange for a reduced sentence and a move to a private medical facility, he's given a full statement to my lawyer. He told them everything about the letters you wrote him, about the way you coached him to guide Mama's hand on the will, about the consulting fees." "He wouldn't," she whispered. "He's my nephew. I'm the only one who ever loved him." "No," I said. "You're the only one who ever used him. And Terrence has one great talent. He will always betray the person who is no longer useful to him. Right now, that person is you." I stood up and smoothed my jacket. "My lawyer, the shark Marcus found, will be serving you with a formal notice of trust dissolution by noon. By the end of the month, this house will belong to the trust. My trust. You'll have 30 days to find a new place to land, Aunt Bess. I suggest somewhere smaller. Somewhere with fewer memories to haunt you." Bess didn't scream. She didn't throw her tea. She just sat there, looking at me with a cold, naked hatred that was far more honest than any smile she had ever given me. "You think you've won, Clarissa. You've destroyed your family. You've put your brother in prison, you've buried your mother in a hole with no one to mourn her, and you're throwing your only aunt into the street. You're going to be the richest woman in Savannah, and you're going to be the loneliest." "I was already lonely, Bess," I said. "I was lonely every time I sat at a table full of people who only saw me as a bank account. I was lonely every time I stayed up until 2 a.m. fixing the messes you all made. The only difference now is that the house is quiet because I chose the silence, not because I'm being ignored." I walked to the door, then stopped and looked back. And as for Mama, she wasn't buried alone. I was there. And for the first time in my life, she didn't have anything to ask of me. It was the best conversation we ever had. I walked out of the house. I got into my car and drove. I didn't go back to the hospital. I didn't go back to Mama's house. I drove to the airport. I had a ticket in my purse, a ticket to North Carolina, to the small plot of land in the mountains that my father had left for me, the one that wasn't tied to the Sterlings, the one that wasn't built on air or secrets. As the plane took off, I looked down at the sprawling green and gray of the Georgia coast. I saw the river winding like a silver thread, the oaks and the marshes. It was beautiful, and it was heavy with the history I was finally leaving behind. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't the tightness of anxiety or the weight of responsibility. It was a lightness, a breath that went all the way down. I was 62 years old. I had spent 40 of those years being a foundation. But as I watched the clouds swallow the earth, I realized that a foundation isn't just for holding things up. It's for starting over. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a decade, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. 3 months later, the air in the Blue Ridge Mountains was crisp and tasted of pine and cold water. I sat on the porch of the small cedar-shingled cabin that had been built on my land. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a Sterling property. It was mine. I had sold the Savannah house to a young couple who wanted to restore the garden. I had used the trust money to ensure Terrence had the best medical care and legal defense possible. But I hadn't visited him. He sent me letters, long, rambling apologies and pleas for a second chance. I kept them in a drawer, unread. Maybe one day I'd be ready, but not today. Aunt Bess had moved to a senior living facility in Florida. She had tried to sue for a portion of the trust, but the shark had made sure the morality clause held like iron. She was living on her Social Security and a small stipend I sent her every month, just enough to ensure she was comfortable, but not enough for her to ever feel like a queen again. My phone buzzed on the table next to my coffee. A text from Simone, my daughter. "Hey, Mom. I'm thinking of coming up for the weekend. I need some advice. Life is getting a little heavy." I looked at the message. For a second, the old instinct kicked in. The strong black woman urge to grab the rope, to pull her up, to fix the world before she even had to ask. But then I looked at the mountains. I looked at the way the trees stood, strong and silent, not because they were carrying the world, but because they were rooted in their own ground. I typed back, "I'd love to see you, Simone, but I'm not giving advice this weekend. We're just going to sit on the porch, drink some tea, and listen to the wind. You're strong enough to figure the rest out on your own. I'm just here to be your mother, not your safety net." I hit send and set the phone face down. I picked up my book, leaned back in my chair, and took a sip of my coffee. The sun was hitting the peaks of the mountains, turning them into gold. The Sterling foundation had crumbled, but the woman who stood on it was finally, truly, standing on her own.